Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor here at Columbia School of International Public Affairs and director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. Really, I'm excited for this event. Appreciate all of your coming out this evening. I'm sure we'll have some more people trickling in, given how much interest there is in the topic. This is obviously a time of enormous change in the Mexican energy sector, marked most recently by constitutional changes made in December that paved the way for foreign investment in what had been a 75-year state monopoly. The potential consequences, as you all know, are enormous for Mexico's energy production, for its economy, for foreign firms, for U.S.-Mexican energy trade and relations. So there's a great deal of interest in what's happening, in understanding what it means. Also a lot of questions about what still has to happen, what could go wrong, what the timeline is, what the risks are. And we're very lucky this evening to have someone uniquely positioned to answer those questions for us. Adrian Lajous has been at the heart of Mexico's energy sector for decades. And in the energy industry there. His career began many years ago when he taught at the College of Mexico and later served as Director General for Energy, and then left government to join Pemex, where he held numerous senior positions, culminating in being appointed CEO, and serves on many corporate boards, has been an advisor to McKinsey, and has been deeply involved in academic work as well, as a senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School, as chairman of the Oxford Energy Institute, and most importantly, as a senior fellow here at Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy, and we are really thrilled to be able to have that sort of partnership with him and have him here in New York, in the Columbia community, working with us, partnering with us, enriching our community, working with students, and doing research on these questions. He'll be doing work for us over the course of this year, both on upstream and downstream issues, looking at a host of questions that are raised by Mexico's transition in the energy sector from a state-owned monopoly to a more open and competitive sector. So we'll have work rolling out over the course and the remainder of this year, and he'll be spending much more time here physically in New York, particularly in the fall, which I'm really excited about. So please join me in welcoming to Columbia Adrian Lajous.
Thank you very much, Jason. I really appreciate very much Jason's invitation to join the Center on Global Energy Policy, and also of giving me the opportunity to be here with you today. I am deeply honored to see John Cotsworth, your provost, here with us today. The only reason he's here is that he's an old friend, and that's what old friends are for. Thank you very much, John. I'm really very pleased to be here, as I mentioned, and I will be speaking about the Mexican energy reform. It's difficult to do it because I don't exactly know the public in this room, and so it was difficult to really try to pinpoint more specifically to the type of topics that you might be interested. So maybe for many of you it would be a bit boring what I have to say. But let me begin. First of all, some of the topics that I would like to cover have to do with the nature, the objectives, and the scope of energy reform in Mexico. I will concentrate most of this afternoon on the drivers for that reform. Why is it that the reform is now beginning? Why has the government decided to do what, just a few years ago, it really thought that it could not. And of course, one has to touch upon some of the principal unresolved questions and issues regarding the implementation of reform. And finally, I'll talk about some of the main risks and implications that reform might have. We're in the very early stage of reform, so it's really very difficult to see what might actually happen in the future. As Jason mentioned, on December 21st of 2013, a constitutional amendment was approved by Congress. And it should trigger, I believe, a very ambitious transformation of the Mexican energy sector. And it should, I think, bring to an end what is in fact the state monopoly that we have had both in the oil sector and in energy. It is, of course, part of a much wider economic reform program that seeks to increase productivity in the Mexican economy. And I would say that this reform has the objective of essentially 7 basic objectives, the biblical 7. Its scope is wide, and it will affect the areas that conform the oil and gas industries and the power sector. So it is really very wide-ranging. I believe that the main objectives, or at least I would like to see that the reform has these objectives, are the introduction of competition in the Mexican energy markets, the opening of oil and electricity to private investment, the maintenance at the same time of state ownership and control of subsoil resources. It's only in the United States. It's a unique feature of the United States that subsoil rights are in the private realm. Everywhere else in the world, it's either, resources are either owned by the crown, by the state, or by the province. So here we will be maintaining the state ownership and control of these resources. And there will be a selective privatization of limited Pemex and CGEP assets sales. The government does not want to even talk about this and insists that, politicians say we will not sell a single screw of any of the Pemex installations. This, of course, is fiction, and there will be, directly or indirectly, many assets that have originally or have always been part of, since 1938, a part of the state sphere that will now be in private hands. Now, this implies, and I think a big test for reform, will be the effective modernization of the state energy companies, both in electricity and in oil. And what is important about this reform is that it will reduce the direct intervention of government in this sector, and it will substitute it by the development of indirect intervention through regulation. Now, as I mentioned before, the scope is wide-ranging. In terms of the oil industry, it includes the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream. And in the case of electricity, reform covers both generation, transmission, and the distribution of electricity. So it is an ambitious reform. Now, the constitutional amendments, I won't go into them, really refer to 3 fundamental articles in the Constitution, Article 25, 27, and 28. And the approved amendments include very precise instructions to members of Congress regarding secondary legislation and enabling laws. It's quite unique thing to put so much in these transitional articles in an amendment. And the reason essentially is the fundamental mistrust in Congress between the different political parties and between Congress and the executive. So they put everything right, they have given instructions to themselves of how the secondary legislation should look like. And this will be, this is what we're currently waiting for, because we want to see how this translates all of these changes into those secondary secondary legislation and the enabling laws. I think it will also give ample space to regulation, and that will evolve much more slowly than all of this legislative change that you're seeing. Now, what have been the main drivers of the Mexican energy reform? I assume that something that concerns policy elites in Mexico in a very significant way is the slow economic growth and the slow productivity growth of Mexico over the last 30 years, and I will come to this. There's, of course, a problem with very low investment in relation to GDP, and very specifically, huge underinvestment in public goods. Another driver has been, without doubt, the fall in crude oil production and in exports. Natural gas production has been stagnant and sort of gradually falling, but natural gas imports have really increased dramatically. And finally, another very important driver is the uncompetitive electricity tariffs that are particularly hurting the private sector in Mexico. They're hurting all of us, but they are clearly affecting industry in a way that they have reacted to this in very strongly. And finally, there are serious public finance constraints and a basic financial weakness of the state that has been affected the energy sector for a number of years now. And I think all of these drivers and the conjunction of all of these drivers is what probably explains the decision of the government to go ahead with energy reform. But I insist, and I would like to insist, energy reform is just part of a larger set of reforms that are being proposed in Mexico today. Let's start with economic growth. And I think it's absolutely crucial. First of all, economic growth is very slow in terms of Mexico's own past history and in relationship with other countries, both its main trading partners, but also with respect to what is happening in other countries in Latin America. As you can see, we had 3 decades of average rate of growth of about 6.5%, and now we're finished 3 decades in which the rate of growth, the average rate of growth for the last 30 years was 2.4%. Now, in the last 3 years, if you take 2011, 12, and 13, the rate of growth is even slower. So this clearly is affecting the view of government officials and the view more generally of policy elites in Mexico. Now, notwithstanding this, there has been a very significant increase in private direct investment in Mexico. And this has been very much concentrated in the manufacturing sector, and more specifically, very much concentrated in not only in manufacturing, but in the modern sector as such. At the same time, gross fixed capital formation has been very stable, at least in terms of GDP. And these numbers are relatively low compared to other countries in Latin America. And I would like to call your attention to the fact that within gross fixed capital formation, public sector investment is particularly low. And that explains why, as I mentioned before, the disaster regarding public goods. And the educational system is in shambles. The health system is in shambles. And I would say more generally, you have a serious problems with physical infrastructure throughout Mexico. And what I think many policymakers have not fully understood is that these investment by the public sector are complementary investments to private investment. Private investment needs to have, the state do something about the educational system, about health, and about infrastructure. And it has not been doing this for a longish period of time. Now, within the oil industry itself, there's been the main problem and the main trigger has been the fall in crude oil production. Now, mind you, this is not unique to Mexico. The North Sea has been declining even at a faster rate during the same period. And I'm using as a reference the North Sea, or I could use also Alaska, simply to say that, Mexico is not unique in that respect. And all of these assets were developed more or less at the same time. Alaska, the North Sea, their development began in the early 1970s, just as in the case of Mexico. But Mexico has had a very rapid fall in production, particularly after 2004, and that has taken a toll, again, within the policy circles in Mexico. Now, just remember that the 100-plus year history of Mexican production is really the history of its giant and supergiant fields. Every production cycle, all of them that we have had, is explained by the discovery, the development, and the decline of these giant and supergiant fields. The first one to be discovered was Ébano in 1908. Then came Poza Rica in 1930, Samaria in 1972, and Cantarell and Cusap-Malob in the 1970s. Now, Cantarell is today, which has been the jewel of the crown, is now in a very advanced decline. Production in the Acal field has dropped by an order of magnitude from over 2 million barrels a day to 200,000 barrels a day at the end of 2013. Part of it has been compensated by Cusap-Malob, but this other supergiant field, again, a very important field, has peaked. So essentially, all of these giant and supergiants, some have peaked long time ago, and the most recent ones have begun to peak. And the problem is that, once you have discovered and developed 5 fields of this size, the probability of finding a 6th one is a very low one. So here, you never say never in these things because it is geology that prevails, but it is very important to note that unless you find another really giant or supergiant field, the probability of sustaining production is relatively small, with one exception. And that is if in the north of Mexico, we do effectively have adequate shale and unconventional resources, both of oil and gas, and that could do the trick in terms of not only sustaining production, but increasing it. My own view, after looking in certain detail at the largest 25 fields today in Mexico, is that it is going to be difficult, at least over the next 4 or 5 years, to do anything about production. The best that we can hope for is flat production during the next 4 or 5 years, and this is important because for the government, it's very difficult to embark in a major reform that is going to have heavy political costs, while at the same time not having any of the benefits, short term, of those changes. So production is a serious issue. And so is exports to the U.S. Exports to the U.S. have fallen for two reasons, because production fell, but more recently, because the U.S. has increased production and has reduced dramatically its imports, except from Canada. So all of the other major exporters to the U.S., the volume that they are exporting to this country have been going down. And that means that essentially Mexico and other producers will have to look to Asia to sell crude that has been displaced effectively from the United States. Now, the U.S. has reduced its imports, its exports, I'm sorry, of crude oil, its imports of crude oil, but at the same time, it has increased dramatically its exports of oil products. Exports of crude, as you know, with a few exemptions, are prohibited. So that essentially means that a big part of this increase in production is going to the refining sector and being exported as products. And the main buyer of those products, the main single buyer of those products, is Mexico. Now this, what has happened, in fact, is that now a very large proportion of Mexican oil product and natural gas requirements are in fact imported from the United States. And this, Mexico has become highly dependent on the free flow of these products and of natural gas. And, it is a big volume. Just think that, crude exports today cover about half of the oil product and natural gas imports that we make. So half of what we sell is simply to cover the bill of the imports that we are doing. This, of course, has given Mexico a great opportunity because we're buying very inexpensive products, relatively inexpensive products from the U.S., relatively inexpensive gas, but at the same time, it is creating certain longer-term problems and issues. Now, on the natural gas front, the situation is, natural gas became a main issue in the last 3 years. And it became a main issue because we have gone through a major natural gas supply crisis. Deliveries to industries and to the power sector have been curtailed. Although low-cost overland imports from the U.S. have increased because of, have not been able to increase because of pipeline constraints, we've had to increase the imports of LNG on the west coast of Mexico. And these imports, the price of these imports are Japanese prices. That means essentially 4 times more expensive than the price of natural gas in Henry Hub, in the, let's say, Gulf Coast of the United States. Now, I hope that the pipelines that are being constructed right now in Mexico will effectively eliminate these constraints, and we should have significant relief by the end of 2015. But notwithstanding this, it was a major crisis, and it was deeply felt by the private sector, and it was deeply felt by the power by the electricity sector in Mexico. Mexican natural gas consumption can be seen on this graph, and as you can see, the biggest consumer of natural gas is the power sector. And today, gas and electricity in Mexico are intimately linked. The share of gas will continue to increase as pipeline construction and expansion take place and open up new markets for natural gas. and of course allow you to increase the supply of gas to new power plants. It is worthwhile noticing also on this graph that the very large share of gas consumption is carried out by Pemex. So that you really have two state entities, two state companies that are the main consumers of natural gas in Mexico by far. Let me go on a bit with electricity. You can see also on this graph before you that first of all, I would say self-supply has become important, and this is mainly electricity that goes to industry. The other thing is the importance of industry as a point of demand for natural gas, and the relatively small amount to the rest of the economy. So gas is really very important because of power generation and because of the pull of industry. Now, all of this sector is subject to extensive subsidies and to cross-subsidization. And there's enormous amount of loss in the system, mainly due to theft. And there's high cost of, for industry. This very high cost really affects competitiveness. And finally, there's no doubt that the government will have to revise in a very fundamental way the tariff design, and this is absolutely imperative. Now, I'm worried that this might coincide, or the timing of that change would take place in 2015, close to when we will be in midterm elections, and those midterm elections could well affect some of these major decisions. Now, regarding the tariffs, just look at the costs of electricity in Mexico in relation to the US. And it's really a big difference. And it is clear that electricity tariffs must change. And Mexico cannot continue to rely on low real wages as the main source of productivity growth. We have to do something in many fronts, but one of them has to do with the tariffs that are being set in the electricity sector. One absolutely key driver of reform has been public finances. And look at this graph, and let me try to describe it. The first thing that I read in this graph is, if you look at the lower left-hand side, you see that the tax burden of Mexico is less than 10%. This is absolutely extraordinary. It is only equivalent to Haiti, which is the poorest country in Latin America. I'm sorry, Haiti, which is the poorest country in Latin America. You see down here the 9.9%. And it is complemented by taxes that the government gets from Pemex. So that's the first thing. The real problem is that we're not collecting taxes. And that's why we need Pemex, because we are not doing our job in terms of tax collection. Now, that is what really makes the public sector and public finances very dependent on the oil industry. 37%, as you can see on the top quadrant to your left, 37% of total government revenues, federal government revenues, come from the oil industry. It's a huge amount. If you look at it from the perspective of Pemex, and to be more precise, Pemex exploration and production, you see that Pemex pays 67% of its revenues It pays 2/3 of its revenues in the form of taxes to the government. And if you look at it in terms of its, not of its revenues, but of its income before taxes, it's 91%. This really is quite unsustainable over the long term and will need to change dramatically with reform. The problem is that if you really want the private sector to come into the oil industry in Mexico, you are going to have to change the tax regime. The Mexican government believed that this could be done because they assumed that there was going to be an increase in production over the next few years of about 500,000 barrels per day, and that prices would remain at current levels or possibly increase slightly. If you assume that production is not going to grow over the next 5 years, it's going to be very difficult to reduce taxes in the oil industry in order to bring in private investment. So, the fiscal situation is a very complex one, and the only thing that I would like to say is that poor states, and the Mexican state is in poverty, cannot have strong and rich state oil companies. So it's this conjunction that has made it very difficult to allow Pemex to develop over time. A few comments about the reform process. The constitutional amendments were only a first step. There's a change in the law, and it's a very important change. It's a fundamental change, but it's only the beginning, and it's the beginning of a very lengthy process. The secondary legislation package has yet to be sent to Congress. It has been deferred time and time again. The president originally said that he was going to send legislation before the 5th of February, and we're still at this point waiting for that to happen. And the problem is that the regular period of Congress ends at the end of this month. So they have to send that legislation before that happens so as to have an extraordinary period in Congress to discuss energy reform this summer. And I hope that this will happen because otherwise it would delay things in a dangerous way. Now, we are moving from very entrenched state monopolies. I mean, in the case of the oil industry, we're talking about a 75-year-old state monopoly. In the case of electricity, a 53-year-old state monopoly. And we're moving from there to a more competitive environment with private participation. And that is a big change. The establishment of the new oil regime, it has its own rules, its own institutions, new players, new patterns of engagement, and clearly new policy options. And all of this will be, a big and important set of changes. And at the same time, government has tended, and that's very understandable, has tended to oversell its reform. We all do that. We all tend to oversell whatever it is that we're doing. The government is no exception. My only concern with that is that it might be generating expectations that will not be fulfilled and that will be a source of frustration in many quarters. And finally, the other thing that I would like to mention is that I am concerned about the potential impact of midterm elections on the timing of the whole process. And so we have to be very careful in that respect. Now, this is, or tries to be, a description of what the new energy sector structure is going to look like. You have the Department of Energy, the Department of the Treasury, the Bank of Mexico. On the one hand, you have Pemex and the CFE. an important change that the law puts forward is that Pemex and CFE will become a new type of state companies in the sense that they will be operating in a competitive environment, and instead of simply being a department of government, which is what in de facto it has been for a long time, they have to be given much greater freedom to operate to be able to compete. So there will be a change in what, in Mexican terms, they talk about state productive companies to distinguish between state companies as they have been in the past. The other new elements that the law brings are in the area of these decentralized state entities that you see on your left, which are in fact the independent operators both of the natural gas system and of the electricity grid. These are new entities, new institutions that have to be formed. They don't exist today, but have to be created. In the case of what is called the coordinated regulatory bodies, you have there again a very important change in terms of strengthening both regulatory, the Energy Regulatory Commission and the National Hydrocarbon Commission, and inventing a new agency, which is the National Safety and Environmental Protection Agency. So this is totally new. And also totally new is, to your right, the Mexican Oil Stability and Development Fund. That is a public trust established in the central bank itself. So this is more or less the new structure that is being proposed, and we will not be able to see until we have the secondary legislation in more detail each one of its entities and the way in which they differentiate their role accordingly. Now, what has called attention in the media recently has been what is called the Round Zero, which is the initial asset allocation to Pemex. And this is the first step in the upstream reform. And the timing is pretty strict. The request was presented by Pemex on March 21st, and the Secretary of Energy has to answer Pemex request by the 17th of September of this year. Now, the criteria are pretty straightforward in the case of producing fields. What the law says is that all producing fields on 21 December 2013 go to Pemex. So, that is one aspect, and that shouldn't create much of a problem. It's pretty easy to know which are those fields that we're producing at the time. What is more complex are exploration areas where Pemex has invested money. In some cases, it hasn't yet, but hopes to do it. And areas where there have been some discoveries. And that's what I think would really be the discussion between the government and Pemex over the summer. Exactly how to allocate these exploration areas. And it's not going to be an easy discussion. I can already see tension building up between the two. You can see it in press releases and press conferences. Clearly, there is already an element of conflict. Now, what's interesting is that in Pemex's wish list, what Pemex has asked for, its letter to Santa Claus, some say, it really retains a small share of the estimated shale resources in the north of the country, and it relinquishes major areas in Chicontepec, which is also a non-conventional resource area in the state of Veracruz. But what is important, I think, and has already been established both in law and if I understand correctly, in an understanding between the government and Pemex, is that Pemex will have to compete for additional acreage in subsequent bidding rounds. And that's where I think the discussion will be on that front and how it intersects with the current exploration areas, which Pemex already claims as having carried out a significant amount of investment. This just tells you how the wish list was produced. In terms of prospective resources, Pemex is asking for 82% of the prospective onshore resources. In shallow water, it is requesting 63%. In deep water, and this again, prospective resources, these are not reserves. Deep water, 29%, and in shale, only 15%. If you look at it from a reserves point of view, and the one, obviously the important one is the 2P reserves, the proven and probable reserves, Pemex is requesting 83% of this. Now, I think the tension here is that on the one hand, clearly Pemex will continue to be a dominant player in the Mexican market. And that is what it should be. It's the only protection that the Mexican state has with respect to the full denationalization of the oil industry. I think what worries many people in Mexico, it worries me deeply, is that privatization, if you want to call it, will imply not only a transfer of resources from the public sector to the private sector, but more importantly, that it could mean denationalization. This is what happened with banking. Commercial banks were not only privatized, the sector was effectively denationalized. And I think that the only protection to the denationalization, at least initially, the only protection to denationalization is to having a strong Pemex, a Pemex that continues to be a dominant company, but now that has to operate in a competitive environment. And we will have to see if Pemex is capable of making that transition. If it doesn't, I think we would be in even deeper trouble than where we started from. There's so many issues that are outstanding that all I want to say is I just wrote down a number of them, but they only open up other questions and other issues. What I want to say is that we're at the very beginning of a process. And every direction that you discuss, there are other issues and new issues that have to be looked at. There's a question, for example, about concessions. The law says that concessions are prohibited, but then in another place, the law also says that it will allow license contracts. What is this? License is the word that we use today for what used to be concessions. So, is it a license? Is it a contract? What is a license contract? If you look at the Peruvian license contract, which is the only precedent that I've been able to find in this respect, the only thing is that it is a concession, but instead of talking about the concessionaire, it talks about the contractor. It looks like a concession, it walks like a concession, it quacks like a concession, so I suspect it must be a concession. But this type of discussion is going to get tough, I think, in the next few months. Also, what is the nature of Pemex's participation in joint ventures? The government might have a different view from Pemex. Pemex would like to farm out, to get all of these resources, farm some of them out, and with the product of that, finance investment in the upstream and maybe in other areas in Pemex. The other question that has to be discussed is the nature of contracts and their variability and the adequacy of these type of contracts in the specific environment of Mexico. Mexico has suffered from deep corruption in its oil sector, in its energy sector in general. And the question is, will we have, tailor-made contracts to different players, or are we going to have more uniform, open bidding, open and transparent bidding processes on much more standardized contracts? That's a fundamental issue that has to do with the political environment under which we operate. In the midstream, hundreds of questions that have not been, none of them have been elucidated yet. And in downstream, just to mention a very significant one, it has to do with pricing. And there again, I'm worried about elections. How are we going to transit to a fully competitive pricing? When are we going to do it? Is it all going to begin through competition with imports? Or how will it take place? Will the government bite the bullet and eliminate all subsidies before an election, for example? It's a question. And all of this, hundreds of other questions. It's at hours just sort of throwing out questions that need an answer in order to understand more deeply what it is that the government really wants to do. There's an issue of implementation and of the timing of all of this, the sequencing, what sequence has to be followed. And that's not easy. It will not be easy at all for the government to define this. And, you know, the problem is, to me, with reform is that up till now, the government has essentially given priority to mobilizing investment, private investment, to the upstream. That's what has really worried them, and the reason is that they want those, that influx of investment to Mexico. I believe that the reform is a much more ambitious and more important process than simply tapping into that market. I understand why it is being done and why it is important, but at the same time, I think it's too narrow an objective. The key, of course, task will be the execution of the round zero and the design of the new contracts. That's really fundamental. And the government expects to sign an initial round of contracts in the first half of 2015, and I personally believe that that is not realistic. It will take longer. It's a complex and difficult process, and it will take time. Now, the regulators and the Energy Department itself are not really adequately equipped for historical reasons. You know, as long as you had a state monopoly like Pemex, it was difficult for the ministry to develop into a strong entity. So that is a serious problem today when you're trying to face the challenges of reform. And, you know, as I want to stress that the government must really transmit a clear sense of direction and identify some quick wins that will be able to, it will allow it to mark progress. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult. I've talked too much, and I wanted to say something about electricity. We tend to concentrate on oil, and I'm doing the same thing, concentrating on oil. I wish I had more time so I could say at least something about electricity, but if later on you want to talk about electricity, we can go back to it. Now, let me end with these last two graphs, which, you know, somehow these last two slides that I will show you place the industry in the overall structure of the Mexican economy. And it is a unique position, without any doubt. A unique position among oil-producing developing countries. The industry contributes only with about I would say only is, I shouldn't say that. It contributes with 6% of GDP. That's very different from, you know, the oil industry and practically all other oil-producing developing countries. In terms of exports, 15% of total exports are oil. You know, it's important, no doubt, but it's a small proportion. All of our exports are in the manufacturing sector. If you look just at one subsector, the automotive industry, exports almost twice as much as the oil industry. So, you know, we have a very different economy than that of most of the oil-producing and exporting countries, a more complex and more diversified one. And, you know, clearly, and you can see it in this graph and in the next one, the importance of manufacturing exports, and particularly manufacturing exports to the U.S., and also this growing economic integration into North America. My last graph has to do with Mexican manufacturing exports. And although I fully recognize the importance of the oil industry in Mexico, my main conclusion is that energy reform might not directly, and I want to stress directly, contribute much to economic growth in the short and medium term. It will do so indirectly by not doing, essentially by not doing any harm to the rest of the Mexican economy. It's a very modest proposal that I want to put forward. It's not this great objectives and this grandiloquent purposes of energy reform that I think are relevant. It's a much more modest one. Do no harm. And to do no harm, you know, it really implies, I think, that supplying final products, that is electricity, natural gas, oil products at competitive prices, is what is really important in terms of stimulating the manufacturing sector in Mexico. And that the success of an energy reform will not be in terms of what happens in the energy sector itself, but what happens to other sectors as a product of reform. And that's why I believe it is the indirect impact of reform that is really what is important. Now, I'm in a minority view. The government still believes that what is really essential is the inflow of capital associated to the opening up of the Mexican oil industry. I believe that the real test of the reform is what it does to the growth of manufacturing industry and to productivity. And the reason is because productivity is because it is in manufacturing where you have higher productivity, but even more important than that, where productivity grows more rapidly. And that is absolutely essential for the growth of the Mexican economy. So in that sense, it is the indirect effects of reform, I think, that are the ones that are really important. But I will stop here. I've already talked too much and over too many subjects, so that you have a wide menu on topics that you might want to discuss now.
Thank you so much. That was a really comprehensive and broad, sweeping survey of what's happening in Mexico. I really learned a lot. So we have about 35 minutes for questions. Adrian and I will have a short conversation to kind of kick it off, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone else. So you talked a lot about the challenges, and every question you open, there are 3 questions layered underneath. But I just wanted to ask you to sort of, prediction is always a difficult thing, but where you think this is all headed. Are you optimistic or pessimistic, given what you just described, that Mexico is going to get this right? And what are the key indicators over the next, say, 6 months that you'll be looking for, or that we should be looking for, that'll help us understand, are they on the right track or the wrong track?
Well, one of the things that I've learned in the oil industry is that even prediction of the past is a very difficult subject. Predicting the future is every time I've tried to do it, I've been wrong. So I've learned a bit on that. I would say that I am pessimistic in the short term. As I mentioned before, for example, on the production front, I don't think there will be much change in the next 4 or 5 years, where I think the probability of change is very low. The weight of inertia is too great to turn around the path of production. It requires enormous luck and an enormous amount of resources. And it has to do with the fact that you have very mature resources today. The reserves that Mexico holds today are very mature assets, are composed of very mature assets. So renewing that stock of assets is difficult. It's not easy, and it will not happen quickly. You might get a quicker success in terms of starting a flow of investment into the Mexican oil industry in a shorter term, let's say in a period of a couple of years. Now, mind you, I don't think it will be a big number initially. Remember, exploration takes time. Making decisions with respect to exploration are slow. Once you start to drill, it also, that's when you're doing the exploration work. There again, the big money is not there. It's in the development phase. So, building up investment by the private sector is not something immediate. It's something that will take time. So, yes, there will be probably flows of investment earlier on, but, they will not turn around the path of production as we've seen it until recently. So I am a pessimist in the short and I would say the midterm. Now, further out, I would say that that's where I think the opportunities lie, but it is difficult to define the size and nature of those opportunities at this point of time. But clearly, I think with competition, with more resources flowing into the energy sector in Mexico, I think that we can have very positive results.
Were you surprised by I should say, by the way, for those people watching online, you can also submit questions via Twitter, so you can participate interactively even if you're not in the room, and we'll take some of those questions as well. Were you surprised by really, I think people were generally, I want to know if you share this view, surprised at how quickly the government was able to make this, build this coalition, build consensus across parties, and make the reform happen in December. Were you as well, and what do you attribute that success to?
I would say that I was positively surprised by speed, and I was negatively surprised by the lack of a deeper discussion of what were really the objectives of reform and what were the strategies that are involved in this process. Unfortunately, because the government was pressed for time, it managed to get through Congress without too many problems, and managed to get this through Congress. And the constitutional amendment change put in place. But at the same time, I think the cost of that speed was that there was not adequate discussion, public discussion of reform. And, this is a major reform. It's not a small thing. And I really would have hoped a much more participatory discussion in Congress and in the media regarding reform.
So what do you think that means for the path forward, for the secondary laws, for the ability to maintain this political consensus?
Well, even in the midterm, today, I follow the industry carefully, and I have so many questions about the future. People that, are not as close to the industry as I have been, have even more problems trying to understand what all this is about. And so in that sense, I think that's what the cost is going to be of the speed at which legislation was passed. But on the other hand, yes, I mean, it's in a certain sense, the political success of getting that those constitutional amendments is something absolutely not only surprising, but in a sense admirable.
What are you most worried about as you look out over the next 6 to 12 months in terms of what needs to kind of go right? What are you most concerned with?
See, I'm more concerned by those areas that are less well thought out. And I think the most important area in that respect is electricity. It's very little that we can really say today of what the electricity sector is going to look 5 years from today. And I think that electricity is absolutely crucial in terms of the criteria I was mentioning before, that, the impact on the manufacturing sector, the impact of electricity or changes in electricity would be, I think, can be very great and would be very fast. So in that respect, I'm worried about not really understanding more clearly what it is that the government is pursuing in terms of the reform of the electricity sector. The downstream worries me enormously. We've all concentrated, again, I mean, the discussion of energy reform in Mexico has concentrated not only on oil, to the detriment of electricity, but also within oil to the upstream. And we have not really publicly discussed the downstream and the prerequisites of change in the downstream. So that is, not well understood. And mind you, I believe that particularly the midstream part of the oil industry is going to be critical. Remember that we are changing the sourcing of the oil or the products, and the destination is changing because of demographic changes in Mexico. So the midstream, where we have underinvested significantly over the years, where there's real serious problems in all of the logistical infrastructure. I mean, not very different from what happened here in this country recently, but probably even more so. We really don't know where that will be moving to. And that worries me. And on the upstream front, there's so many questions that I still have that it's difficult to pinpoint anything in particular. I think that the first step regarding ground zero is an important one, and that will help us. It will help define a lot what will be the next steps further down.
And what do you think the reaction from some of the foreign investors, from some of the IOCs will be in round zero? How much are they going to hold back and wait and see what's going on?
No, I mean, everybody has to hold back to see what goes on in round zero. After that, I think that the super majors clearly are interested, particularly where the biggest risks are, and obviously the biggest returns, and where the complexity is greatest. And I suspect that is in deep waters offshore in Mexico. So there, the players will probably be mostly composed of the really major oil companies, major international oil companies. I think a different situation will probably evolve on the unconventional resources. And there you will get a mix of players more similar to the ones that you have on this side of the border. I mean, just remember that our unconventional resources are right at the border, on the Mexican side of the border, across the river from the South Texas Eagle Ford formation. And, you know, I've done a lot of oil tourism in that area. And, you know, when I visit fields there, I can see from fields on the U.S. side, the Mexican fields on the other side of the river. So I suspect that, you know, the type of players that you will get in unconventional resources will be essentially the same players that are on the U.S. side, which means a mix of all sorts of companies, from relatively small independent oil companies to some of the biggies.
And can you talk a little bit about what impact what's happening in the U.S. is having in Mexico, the shale revolution, the sharp increase in product exports, the reduction in our imports?
Well, it's a major impact. First, let me talk about the negative part of that impact. And the negative part of the impact is that the rapid development of very extra light crude and condensates in the U.S. is displacing Mexican exports to the U.S. Gulf Coast. And already for practical purposes, we are not exporting anymore, except small amounts of light and extra light crudes to the U.S. Now, mind you, nothing personal. This has happened to everybody else. All the West African production, North African production, among others. So that's negative. I'm worried.
So explain why that's negative in terms of there's
we're
global
losing,
demand for
we're
oil.
losing market in the U.S., and that means the only place where you can place that crude oil will probably be China, will be Asia. And the issue there is what will be the speed at which Asian refineries, deep conversion refineries, will be built. Because it is these refineries that will eventually take not only the light crude, but will take the heavy crudes in which Mexico specializes. My worry is not so much what has already happened in terms of the displacement of Mexican exports, but what might happen if the Keystone XL is approved, because then you'll have a big flow of heavy crude oil from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, and that will effectively displace heavy Mexican crude oil. And that is the one that will, I suspect, will be a bit more difficult to redirect to Asia at prices that are, do not imply a big hit in terms of the netbacks that you receive in Mexican ports. Because not only the transport costs to Asia, but more importantly, because we could easily saturate Asian markets with heavy crude oils displaced from the U.S. Gulf Coast, where it took a long time to develop these deep conversion refineries to run that heavy crude, and here you want to do it at a faster pace. Remember, the Canadian stuff is the moment that the pipeline starts operating, the flow is immediate. You get a huge amount of heavy crude from Canada flowing into the Gulf of Mexico.
So the global demand is there, but you're worried about a discount.
Different pricing structures, and developing new strategies to place that oil in a very different environment. There were enormous advantages to us of being in the Gulf of Mexico. From the field in Campeche to the Houston ship channel, it's a 2-day journey. In fact, Mexican crude oil was the shortest haul crude in the U.S. Gulf Coast because of pipeline programming in the U.S. Anything that you sold into the U.S. Gulf market took much longer to flow there than the stuff that came from Mexico. Mm-hmm. So, those logistical advantages clearly would be lost.
And in terms of shale gas and tight oil in Mexico, you mentioned you think it'll be some of the same independents who've made it work in the U.S. will be crossing the border. Is that how quickly do you think that'll happen? What are the challenges? It's the same formation, but is there a reason it's going to take some time?
Jason, I think it will take some time. I think that the question that we have all asked ourselves is how replicable is the U.S. experience? You know? Can you really replicate that? And I think that there's many elements that militate against, a real replica of what has happened, let's say, in Eagle Ford on the Mexican side. There's many elements that make it different. Now, mind you, in spite of all of those things that will make it different, all that will do is that it will be more costly and it will take more time than it happened in the U.S. But at the same time, I would say that if there are attractive resources in the north of Mexico, those resources are going to be produced. Now, it will take longer and it will cost a bit more. And then you get into the issue of competitiveness. But essentially, it will flow, but it will take longer.
Let me ask the last question, and while I'm asking that, if people could step forward to the microphones here if you have a question that you'd like to ask, and we'll just ask people to sort of queue up, and if you do it at the microphone, that way people watching online can hear your question. You talked again about all the challenges, the issues that have to be resolved, concessions versus licenses, and a whole long list of things. I won't repeat it. But this is not new. Lots of other countries have done this. What are the models you look to? Are there things you think that kind of what should be replicated? Are there what models do you see around the world where people have attracted private investment and ended sort of state-owned monopoly control of the energy sector in a way that you think would be a good approach for Mexico?
I don't want to fall again into this uniqueness about Mexico. I hope that we are capable of evolving a specific model for the specific conditions of Mexico. What I can tell you is, for example, that people in government in Mexico have been looking deeply into what has happened, of course, in Brazil, what's good that has happened in Brazil, and what's bad that's happened in Brazil. I think a lot of people in government today in Mexico admire very much what was done in Colombia, although I'm aware that it was a big change that took place there. Part of the sort of rapid increase in production that is what is so attractive to Mexican officials, it was really a recovery that, after the problems that the industry had in terms of all of the logistics with the guerrilla in Colombia. So, part of it was really recovery. It was not something totally new. But notwithstanding that, I personally have not gone deeply into the Colombian experience, but I know that many people in the Mexican government have been doing it. Now, what we all admire enormously is Norway. Norway has an extraordinary history, I would say mostly in terms of the institutional development in which the oil industry is embedded. But then again, that's managed by Norwegians and not by Mexicans, and I wonder how difficult it will be to tropicalize some of these Norwegian institutions. But personally, I have a very deep admiration for everything that has been done in Norway.
Okay, well, just don't know if you could step forward. Please identify yourself and keep your question brief and make it a question.
Right. Thanks, Jason. Thanks for this fascinating presentation. So first is your take on upstream, because Mexico has, I think, the 8th highest electricity prices, and it's importing.
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Mexican electricity is about, I think, the 8th highest in the world, and then importing $15 LNG. So how do you see the midstream sector on the pipe side, gas pipe, also electricity network, going to be developing over the next 5, 10 years so that you lower costs and improve competitiveness? And if I may, the second question is Mexico going to be competitive on the shale side? Because let's say, for example, you try to produce a lot of gas, but in U.S. gas is still very cheap, maybe $3, $4, or something like that. So will Mexico still be importing a lot more gas before they can actually ramp up production much more? So, thank you.
On the midstream, the first area which is absolutely critical is natural gas, the natural gas pipelines. And those are already being built. I mean, pipes are being laid on the west coast of Mexico to bring in gas from the U.S. all down the west coast. Also, pipes have construction on pipes that will bring gas directly from the U.S. into central Mexico is taking place. So it's now a question of very specific calendars regarding those projects that we're looking to. I think what is important there is that once you have all of these pipelines, that you have a wider grid and a denser grid, you will have a big increase in demand for natural gas. And there, obviously, we would love to be able to supply that with Mexican gas, but if you cannot supply it with Mexican gas, you will supply it with U.S. gas, which is, is an ample supply. Again, the big consumption centers in the north of the country will benefit from, having very substantial volumes of gas, 150 miles from Monterrey, the largest industrial city in the north of Mexico, and close to many cities that have more than 1 million people living in them. So first, I think big impact is gas. That's obvious. The process has begun. It could have been done better. I'm sure they will face additional hiccups, but that's going along. I'm more worried about what is going to happen with liquids pipes. We have underinvested in all of that infrastructure, all of the infrastructure for transporting oil products and crude oil. And I think that's where it's going to be. It'll take a little bit more thought on how you go about doing that. But it will have to take place. We have hidden part of the underinvestment in infrastructure for liquids because a lot of volume was being moved by trucks at very high cost, as you know, in this country. How that will solve itself out, to me, it's still very hazy. But clearly that is very important, and particularly important because a big part of domestic requirements will be satisfied by imports. And that means a change in the logistical infrastructure, which is important. But there I couldn't answer directly to your concern, but clearly it is very important. On the shale, I agree with you. I think that current pricing is not conducive to investing in dry gas drilling, which is the case in the U.S. Everybody that can do otherwise, the last thing they want to do is drill for dry gas at current prices. So that will also happen in Mexico. What right now the discussion, and it's still we have very little information, is how much wet gas there actually is in close to the border, and how much tight crude is there. They have drilled some wells that have produced crude. They have drilled wells that have produced wet gas, but there are very few wells, and so it's very difficult to forecast on the basis of such limited information as the one that we have today. But, you know, the same economic conditions will prevail on both sides of the border with respect to shale gas. Well, there again, see, right now in electricity, you have a lot of reserves, energy and surge reserves. So right now is the moment to put out to take out some of the more inefficient power plants that the Federal Power Commission had. It doesn't hurt that much, except from a labor point of view, and that's, I think, what's been stopping it. So right now it's a good moment to rationalize assets of the Mexican public sector. I suspect that all of the increments in natural gas, in power in Mexico will be, at least initially, in combined cycle sets using natural gas, and that will be done by the private sector. And you know, that's practically a manufacturing process. It's relatively simple. The type of risks are limited, or have been limited up till now. A new game is starting, in which you are now opening these things to competition, but that will solve itself out. What's more difficult is transmission. A much greater underinvestment in the transmission sector, probably in transmission and in the distribution. You have, you know, systematically underinvested. And there, the question is, who is going to be the owner of those assets, and how is the independent power operator going to define you know, the amount of additional capacity that is required, and then actually enforce investment in that area. And we don't yet, it's still rather hazy of what are the solutions that the government is thinking about in terms of transmission, and even more so, I think, in terms of the local distribution companies for the electricity.
Let's try to move quickly through the three people who are patiently standing. Please.
Thank you. Buenas tardes. My name is Robert Fishman. I'm with Energize New York and a recent graduate of the Sustainability Management Program here at Columbia, where I did a certain amount of research on the nexus of energy, water in Mexico. And so, you know, one of the notorious stories, of course, is that the amount of energy used to just pump water into Mexico City is the amount used to power all of the city of Puebla. But also in the agricultural sector, you know, so much of the energy use is used in pumping water, partly because of the tariffs, Tarifa 9, that are in place that sort of perversely encourage the depletion of groundwater for agricultural purposes. And at the same time, so much of the electricity generated is from thermoelectric plants within Mexico, something to the tune of 90%. And so there doesn't seem to be a lot of incentives in the past structure. So I will give you the opportunity now to talk about that electricity sector and the tariff reform and where you see that heading and how that might benefit the water nexus with energy in an area that is facing climate change in the near future.
You know, clearly water is and I think will become an even more important policy topic in the future. In the case of electricity tariffs, the biggest subsidy of all is in the agricultural sector for pumping water. So I'm sure that is going to have to change. I know very little about the subject, so I couldn't tell you anything intelligent about what might be the implications of the change in tariffs will have on the agricultural sector generally and in terms of water use. But clearly, if you make a big change in the pricing of the electricity for pumping, something is going to happen. But it's difficult for me to say much more than that. There's other areas in which, the use of water, not necessarily electricity, but in things like shale oil and shale gas development, is going to have a toll. And that is, this morning in a talk I gave, I said that God had been very generous with Texans and had given them this huge aquifers right next to the Eagle Ford formation that has allowed them to develop that without, excessive conflict. I believe that in Mexico, in the north of Mexico, not only where it's a desert, but where desertification is advancing, the water conflicts that will arise in the case of shale development are going to be very great. And they will be increased by the fact that the owner of the land, or the people that occupy the land surface, are different from the owner of the resource, which is the Mexican state. So there's no alignment whatsoever between the objectives of landowners and the people that are working in the subsoil. So in that respect, I think the potential for conflict is enormous. If you have some agricultural activity in this desert up there, you take water from people, they're going to be very unhappy, whatever the use it is given to it. So water clearly is a topic. Now, in terms of the electricity sector, I know that there's been a lot of discussion with respect to large-scale power projects. And it is very difficult today to build in Mexico any sort of big hydropower facilities. And I think it will become more so as time goes by. The discussion is if, smaller size hydropower projects might turn out to be more attractive in the near future. But I really don't know much about the topic.
No, I think we're just about out of time, so let's talk about after the line. Let me ask you both to ask your questions, maybe one after the other. We'll give you a chance to answer both of them, and then we'll end very close to on time.
Thank you. My name is Lisa Singleton, and I'm here on the faculty at Columbia CEPA. I am most interested in labor and middle class issues, and I wanted to ask a little bit about the political perception of some of these reforms. Labor and middle class issues. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the political perception of some of these reforms. What role has energy reform played in the Pacto por México? And perhaps you could give some insight into labor reactions to the energy reform discussions so far. And my second question is about investment trails. And I understand that, of course, foreign investment is probably what will be the first attraction in some of these reforms. I wanted to ask a little bit about the appetite for native investors, particularly the Afores system, whether or not there might be some interest and discussions already happening in native investment circles. Thank you.
Ask your question, and then we can answer all of them together.
Yes, hi. So one of the things that's picking up steam here in the U.S. is the question of whether the oil export ban should be lifted. So my question was, under the hypothetical instance that it is lifted, whether you think that that creates enough room for the Mexican imports not to get displaced if the U.S. is able to export that light crude that is taking the Mexican crude out of the refineries in the Gulf.
So labor issues, investment, domestic, foreign, and oil exports in the U.S.
You know, the political reaction to reform has been surprisingly subdued. Clearly, the only significant opposition has been from the left. And I would say that more deeply embedded and has not come out as strongly as I would have imagined is some of the more nationalist groups within the PRI party. They have been very subdued, and they have been disciplined by their leadership. But I think embedded in there is a lot of reticence and a lot of mistrust, and I would say concern, I mentioned before, about the denationalization of the oil and power sectors. And it's deep down there. If this process takes too long, if things don't work out in a more or less reasonable way, you might revive some of this opposition. But, you know, between the PRI party and the PAN party, they managed to ram reforms through Congress without any problem. No basic problem. I mean, it was horrible because essentially all of these legislators say we're here to vote, not to discuss. You know, they just wanted to get things done quickly. So I think there's still a lot of problems in that front that might arise if, you know, any further corruption scandals appear, any derailment of the reform process takes place. It's not a done deal, but at the same time, up till now, it's been surprisingly weak, the reaction to a major reform like this. So that's a bit surprising. Now, with respect to other, not only private foreign investment, direct investment, but domestic investment, not only in the Afores, but, you know, the participation of Mexican firms in the development, you know, private firms in the development of the oil industry, I think you will see some companies starting to work in Mexico. Mexican companies will join in. In some cases, joint venturing with non-Mexican companies, in other cases on their own. But they will be relatively small to the size of the international players. And so that's going to be an issue. On the oil export ban, I'm looking at the clock, not at the questions, which I like very much. On the oil export ban, you know, the light crude, as I said, has already disappeared. You could set up, and I've made a very modest proposal, of actually importing some crude from the U.S., hopefully under a scheme similar to the one that you have with your other partner within the North American Free Trade Agreement, and allow some exports of very light crude to 3 specific Mexican refineries. And it's difficult for me to see if that is really feasible or not. I'm not that much worried anymore about light and extra light crudes. What concerns me today is the impact of heavy crude flow from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. That will really displace. We have specialized in heavy crude. So we're more interested in what happens to heavy crude in the future. On the light crude side, that's history. What I'm interested in is what will happen with the flows of heavy crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And that could really be a serious event, I think, for Mexico. And I'm not sure that any type of arrangement regarding, you know, a small amount of exports of light crude oil to Mexico will change that at all, because what we're really talking about is heavy crude.
Great. There is a need for good analysis on the issue of U.S. crude oil exports, which is why it's one of the major studies that the Center will be doing for the next 6 months. So look out for that by way of promotion. But I've learned a lot. I really am grateful to you for affiliating with us, for being here and spending so much time with students this week, and for your lecture this evening. Please join me in thanking Adrian Lajous.